Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
Independent Lens brings us together
How you gonna make your story better?
and ignites conversations with community cinema,
Even though you did a criminal act, you wasn't a real criminal.
with screenings in local communities. Coming this season, The Home Stretch,
We're gonna have to do a lottery and everybody's not gonna be able to get in.
I've been homeless for a while now, since I've been like 14.
Most important thing I'm trying to do is give them stability here.
The National Weather Service.
Good evening, I'm Bob Clay and welcome to Alaska Weather. Let's move right into the show here. There's a lot going on, particularly in the northern tier of the state here. Now, all the red areas you see up here, particularly along the Arctic coast and also in the Kobuk valleys and Noatak valleys and along the northern portion of the Seward Peninsula there, those are blizzard warnings in effect. And those are in fact into the Sunday hours. And we'll look at it in a minute here. We'll be able to see what's going on. But there's a frontal system kind of sweeping across the coast there. So in advance of it, we'll see the blizzard warnings. And then on the backside with a gusty northwest winds and the blowing snow. And a lot of these areas you see in yellow those are winter weather advisories. And that's predominantly for blowing snow. However, as you get down along the Alaska range there, we are looking for a fair amount of snow and with some blowing snow associated with that frontal system. Okay, and just check your local sources of weather for the latest information on those advisories and warnings. Okay, now let's take a look here. You can see the back edge of this front as it starts to sweep across here. Very strong winds, particularly on the back side of this system here. We've got another broad front which is moving over towards Shimia, and that's going to be working in this way and bringing another batch of moisture, but I think it's going to hold at least for a while west of the western mainland there. And you can see over the North Gulf Coast, there's really not a lot going on right now, generally fair skies, and a few clouds over in southeast Alaska. We'll just kind of set this in motion again one more time here. You can see that front starting to work its way across. Actually, with this frontal system out towards Shimia, they had gusts about 70 miles per hour with the approach of that, so out of the south. So pretty potent front there. And then we'll just kind of look at the visible satellite imagery. Really not a lot to see, at least through the time periods where we actually have the data through the early afternoon hours. But generally cloudy conditions over the Gulf of Alaska. And as we get out over into the Bering Sea, Bristol Bay area, there are a few breaks. And again, over towards Sandpoint, there's a few breaks also. Okay, now let's take a look at what we had actually for the weather map today. You can see this cold front here kind of sweeping off to the east here. Snow pretty much over most of the interior areas. Actually, and now snow actually worked its way into the south central Alaska. Blowing snow conditions up along the Arctic coast and the Beaufort Sea coast there. And on the back side of this, some very strong winds on the back side. We did get some clearing on the back side of this front. However, there are some low clouds that are kind of working their way across the Bering Sea. And they're working into southwest Alaska. We did have some breaks along the Alaska Peninsula on the northern side there, as well as the south side. And then we have this next frontal system, which is working its way across. Again, 70 mile per hour winds out of the south associated with that, and also some rain and fog in those areas. Okay, now let's look for tonight's forecast. And what's going to happen is this low pressure center is going to continue to drift off to the north. We're going to see the gradient starting to weaken in advance of this front, though. We'll probably still have gales, but we should see the storm starting to subside in advance of this front. Rain associated with it in advance, and then we'll see some rain showers on the backside. Snow moving up into the Gulf of Anadyr. High pressure, which is over the Bering Sea today, that's going to sweep over or actually move inland for the most part, and we'll see some patchy fog developing in areas associated with that. We'll have a little bit of offshore flow, so maybe a little patchy fog earlier in at least the southwest coast, but then I think as the offshore flow develops, we'll start to see that stuff start to dissipate. Now on the back side of this front, as this front sweeps over into Canada, we're going to see some blowing snow with some pretty gusty easterly winds and northwesterly winds associated with that. And then south of the the Brooks Range there. We'll see there's this trough kind of sweeping south. It's probably more of a secondary cold front, and that's bring a little surge of cold air with it and some snow showers associated with that. And then over south central Alaska, particularly along the North Gulf Coast, as this front kind of moves off to the east, we're going to, and the ridge builds over the mainland, what we're going to see is some outflow winds, particularly over towards Whittier, Seward, and Valdez. Probably will see some wind as well through the Copper River Delta. So some pretty gusty outflow winds expected after about midnight tonight as that front moves through. And now there's a low pressure center, which I didn't really say much about, which was well south of Alaska Peninsula. Well, that's going to kind of move off to the northeast, and that's going to that'll bring some rain over to the central and the southern portions of the Panhandle. And then over the northern end of the Panhandle, we're generally going to be looking at for some rain and snow in those areas. Okay, now as we move towards, whoop, that didn't, well, we'll just try it one more time. There we go, Sunday's forecast. And basically, Sunday we're going to have some pretty good winds through the inner channels over in southeast Alaska with this high pressure center over the mainland, and the low pressure center just well south of the area there. We'll see maybe some patchy fog over the Gulf, but as we get over southwest Alaska, again, a few patches of fog, but I think generally the offshore flow with the high pressure over the mainland should keep most of the fog at bay there. And over the central mainland, we'll see basically high pressure will mainly control most of the mainland. We'll see areas of patchy fog. Probably seeing some breaks later in the day. We'll have some blowing snow still along the Beaufort Sea coast with those strong westerly and northwesterly winds, but we should see that subsiding during the latter part of the day tomorrow. And then over in the Alaska Peninsula, we've got another surge of warm air kind of working its way up with this occluded front here. And basically we'll see rain developing along the south end of the Alaska Peninsula by the afternoon hours tomorrow, with a southerly flow developing. And over the eastern Aleutians and central Aleutians, generally look for rain in most of those areas. Now, a lot of the warm push of air over the Bering Sea, we'll see rain associated with this front, and a lot of low stratus and fog in that area, in those areas, as well as towards the Pribilof Islands. And on the back side, we'll get a little bit of colder air streaming in, so we'll see some rain and snow showers over towards the Shimei area for the most part. And now for Monday's forecast, generally we're going to be looking for high pressure kind of building over the western portion of the Aleutians, western Bering Sea. So we'll see a few breaks there with some patchy fog. Northwesterly flow, pretty brisk, moving towards the central Aleutians by the afternoon hours on Monday, as the low pressure center kind of moves over into the Bering Sea. And generally we're going to see rain just kind of south of this frontal zone, a mixture of rain and snow over southwest Alaska associated with that, even probably all the way up to St. Lawrence Island. And then north of there, we'll see some light snow associated with that low pressure center and a weakening frontal system, which is over the Chukchi Sea there and the Arctic Ocean. Further south now, generally we're going to be looking for basically rain over most of the Gulf, kind of spreading up towards the Kenai Peninsula by the afternoon hours on Monday. Southeast Alaska, I think generally they're going to be in pretty fair shape for the Monday, generally with just some kind of gusty outflow winds, which I think will start to subside during the afternoon hours on Monday. Okay, now let's look for our temperatures around the state. Now for our high temperature, we had 50 degrees down in Klawock, and we'll talk about the low, but that was minus 12 as you get up towards Point Lay up along the northwest coast there. Okay, so generally some 40s and 30s over in southeast Alaska, some 40s for the most part. Along the coastal areas of south central inland, we had some 30s, 20s over the Copper River Basin, and it's just kind of moving north now. We'll see we had 20s for the most part over the interior areas and 20s along the basically Barrow West, and then as you can see over towards Point Lay, even at this afternoon, as of 2 o'clock, it was still minus 11, 2 right just west of Barrow there. And generally, as we get down towards southwest Alaska, generally in the 20s there, and we'll kind of just continue along that theme there. 30s for the most part, 40s over south, or I should say the Alaska Peninsula, and 30s for the most part over the Aleutians. And for some reason, the St. Paul didn't plot up on there. Okay, for tonight's lows, generally we're going to be looking for the most part, about 30s over in southeast Alaska, except as you get up towards Yakutat and up to Skagway there, we'll probably be looking in the upper 20s for the most part. Along the coastal areas, 20s to 30s. Over the interior sections, central interior section, we'll be looking at pretty much single digits, and you can see we'll be looking at minus teens to minus 20s as you get up along the northwest coast and along the Arctic coast there. And then a little bit further out to the west there, the 40s over the Alaska Peninsula, I should say 30s with some 40s just south of the Alaska Peninsula, and 30s for the most part over the Aleutians, and lower 30s in the Pribilof Islands. Now for tomorrow's highs, generally 40s for the most part along the Aleutians and the Alaska Peninsula, upper 30s expected over towards the Pribilof Islands. We'll see some 20s and 30s over southwest Alaska. A little bit cooler as you get over the interior sections, generally in the teens. Still we'll see some minus numbers as we get up along the Arctic coast. Look like the lowest place will be in like the minus teens or so. And as we get over along towards south central Alaska, generally 30s to 40s along the coastal areas, and we'll see some 40s over in southeast Alaska for tomorrow. All right, now for flying weather, as you can see here, pretty much VFR conditions over most of southeast Alaska along the North Gulf Coast. We will see some spotty IFR conditions and basically some fog, and we'll probably, and with some IFR conditions also, and some blowing snow up in the northern areas there. And now as we get over towards the Alaska Peninsula, we noticed as that front was going to start to sweep north there, we'll get some IFR, widespread IFR, expected along the Alaska Peninsula and over the eastern Aleutians, and also along this frontal boundary over the Bering Sea, extending from about Adak or so northward up towards the Gulf of Anadyr. Look for widespread IFR associated with that, and then IFR conditions surrounding those areas. Okay, now for our past conditions around the state. We'll look at Anaktuvik, and we're going to be looking maybe some marginal VFR early on, and should be rapidly become VFR, I would think, by late morning. Anaktuvik, pretty much about the same thing. Lake Clark and Merrill, there'll be IFR tonight, but you know, by tomorrow morning, the time when most people will be flying, it should be VFR in those areas. All VFR conditions, rainy pass for tomorrow. VFR windy also. Isabel will probably start marginal VFR in the morning, but should become rapidly VFR conditions. We'll see the same thing pretty much at Mentasta, and Tanita will be IFR conditions tonight, probably early in the morning, but then certainly by mid-morning we should look for some VFR conditions there. Portage should remain VFR for tomorrow. Chilkoot and White Pass we'll be looking for, you know, again, will be marginal VFR possibly in the morning, but should become VFR pretty rapidly there. Okay, so we can see the freezing level of this white line here at the surface, and up to about 4,000 feet as you get over towards the Unalaska area and the southern portion of the Alaska Peninsula. I should say the south end of the Alaska Peninsula, and then you see well south of that about 6,000 feet, and then with that frontal system, with that warm, moist air kind of working its way off in the western Bering Sea, we'll see the freezing levels increasing quite a bit throughout the day tomorrow. All right, now for the icing conditions. Generally, as that frontal system kind of moves up from the south there, we'll see some icing up to about 12,000 feet, and then along this broad frontal zone here, icing up to about 15,000 feet associated with that. All right, now for our winds aloft, generally we're going to be looking with the high pressure center kind of over the mainland there and extending down over the northwest or northeast Pacific. We'll be looking for about 140 knot jet kind of streaming up from the south and then dropping north out over in the Yukon Territory, about 140 knots or so. Well south there, southeasterly jet about 100 knots, and out towards the Kamchatka Peninsula, looks like about a northwest jet or so, about 130 knots. All right, now at the 9,000 foot level, generally pretty brisk southerly flow just in advance of that frontal system there, so about 50 knots out of the south over the Bering Sea. And then you can see the reflection of this ridge here as it's over the Gulf, extending all the way up into the interior sections of the mainland there, and then kind of the return northwesterly flow on the forward side of the ridge there at about 30 knots over southeast Alaska. And now for the 3,000 foot levels, pretty much use the same chart, change the levels, and just drop the winds a little bit. So a lot lighter winds over in southeast Alaska, but you can see the ridge pretty much, even at the reflection at the 3,000 foot level, pretty much about the same. And then the southerly flow, not quite as strong at the 3,000 foot level as with the 9,000 foot level. And now let's take a look at our turbulence, generally we're going to be looking at some moderate turbulence, about 3,000 feet or so. And then we'll see as we get up along the northwest coast here, as that kind of that northwesterly flow kind of comes across the Brooks Range there, we'll be looking for some moderate turbulence about 5,000 feet above ground level. And then with those gusty winds through the inner channels there with that ridge over the interior there, look for some moderate turbulence below about 3,000 feet or so. Well, that concludes this portion of the show. We'll see you next after with the Marines.
Welcome back to another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider, joined once again by the science liaison of GINA, Eric Stevens. GINA, of course, is the Geographic Information Network of Alaska, based up at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And GINA is all about satellites, and Eric is always here to tell some really cool stuff about satellites. Now, the last time you were here, we talked about how the weather satellites can see clouds and what's under the clouds, but you're telling me that satellites can do a lot more, even protect the general public with aviation safety information.
That's right. There's one particular aspect of satellites we're going to talk about today that might not be immediately obvious, and that is detecting things in the atmosphere that are not clouds, that are not snow, not rain, but rather a hazard that can happen here in Alaska, and that is volcanic ash.
Of course.
When a volcano goes off, puts ash in the air, this is, of course, a hazard to the public if the ash were to fall on the ground in accumulating amounts.
Sure.
Additionally, while the ash is in the air, and this is the more frequent hazard, is it's a hazard to aviation because you cannot fly an airplane into volcanic ash without great risk. Worst case scenario, the ash gets into a jet engine, wrecks the engine, kills the engine, and now you have an airplane flying with no engines. It won't fly for long. So aviators need to avoid that ash. How do you avoid the ash? You have to know where it is by identifying it with a satellite image and perhaps predicting then where the ash will flow with the overall weather patterns. Satellites are so important for identifying when a volcano goes off and then tracking the ash after the volcano injects the ash into the atmosphere.
Now, are you talking about seeing the heat signature or a huge volcanic plume with a cloud that we're used to seeing in the really pretty pictures of any Alaska volcano that's erupted recently, Redoubt, for example? Or are we talking about the really fine details? Because this is polar orbiting satellites, the ones that are very low to the ground, right?
The geostationary satellites can do some detection. The polar orbiters, like you say, they're closer to the Earth. They give the even better view. In answer to your question, I would say all of the above.
Oh, okay.
A heat signature from a volcano going off with all the heat that comes with the eruption, that can be identified in infrared imagery.
Okay.
We've got images from the Kamchatka Peninsula. That's the far eastern part of Russia on the western side of the Bering Sea, loaded with volcanoes.
Right.
You know, Alaska has plenty of volcanoes of its own. We can also be affected when a volcano goes off in Kamchatka, say, and then the weather carries that ash toward Alaska from the west.
Right.
You can see the infrared heat signature, like you say. Also, the ash in the air can be detected by doing some sophisticated channel differencing within the satellite data. You can find the identification of sulfur dioxide, say, that's a component of the volcanic emission, and you can trace this with the satellite imagery. Sometimes volcanoes go off that haven't gone off before, and we're not expecting them to go off. Say if there's no seismometers around a given volcano that hasn't gone off in 100 years, you might not be expecting it to go off in the satellite imagery. Since satellites can be globally comprehensive, that might be the first sign that you have that a volcano in an unexpected area is going off.
So it's a good backup system. Okay.
Right.
Wow.
Right. And people are working all the time on automating the interrogation of satellite data by computers to provide a first alert to a human, so the software will say, we think this might be important. Human, go take a closer look. Because the people are still the best way to interrogate the imagery, but the planet's a big place, and we can't be looking everywhere all the time, so the software helps give a first cut. And then in Alaska, there's a special kind of surprise angle where the satellites are helpful, and that is the Katmai eruption of 1912. Huge eruption. There is still somewhat of a moonscape out there in southwest Alaska where all this ash is laying on the ground. And sometimes a strong weather pattern comes along where we have roaring northwest winds that go across the Alaska Peninsula there and can actually pick some of this ash up off the ground. No volcano is going off. This was more than 100 years ago that volcano actually blew. So you're not going to see a heat signature like we were discussing. There will be no seismic signature of a volcano going off. So those data sets, they'll say, oh, no problem. But you can see in some of the satellite imagery this ash, as it's called, resuspended. When the wind comes along, picks it up, the ash can be lofted a few thousand feet in the air just with the wind. And an airplane flying into that plume is exposed to some danger. So we need to track that ash to provide guidance to aviators that you don't want to be flying here at these elevations in this area. We've got some imagery of the resuspension, and you can see the wind blowing strongly from the northwest, picking up the ash and blowing it down to the southeast. And so that's another, perhaps not immediately obvious hazard of volcanic ash. Katmai is the gift that keeps on giving, for sure.
Very good. So we've got satellites that can help us understand the weather from the past and the immediate past, and we talked last time about how that's feeding into the forecast modeling to help improve predictions, but now they're also protecting the general public with aviation-sensitive information and watching volcanoes, whether they're erupting or maybe have erupted in the past, and finding the left-behinds from those volcanic events there. So really impressive stuff. Eric, thanks so much for joining us again today, and you're a gift that keeps on giving from the satellite community, so thanks a lot, and we hope to have you back again soon. Again, Eric Stevens with GINA at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And if you'd like to check out any of the information that Eric has shared with us again today, you can do that very easily by going to www.gina.alaska.edu. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider, and thanks for joining us for another edition of Alaska Weather Facts.
Welcome back. Let's take a look at the marine forecast for Sunday. And we're going to be looking for the inside waters. Look for generally northerly winds in the central and the southern sections, about 15 knots or so. Lynn Canal and Glacier Bay, northerly winds 25 knots with 5-foot seas. So Eastern Gulf, westerly winds 15 knots with 5-foot seas. And then the central and the, I guess, mid part of the offshore waters, look for northerly winds 20 knots with 6 to 7-foot seas, and northwesterly winds in the southern outside waters there, 20 knots with 7-foot seas. Now in Monday's forecast, we'll be looking for the southern outside waters, northerly winds 15 knots, going a little bit further north there, northeast winds 10 knots with 5-foot seas. The central sections, look for easterly winds at 15 knots with 4-foot seas, and the eastern Gulf with southeasterly winds 15 knots with 4-foot seas. Lynn Canal and Glacier Bay, look for northerly winds 30 knots with 6-foot seas. 20 with gusts of 40 over towards Frederick Sound, central portions of the inside waters there, and then further south there, easterly winds 20 knots with 4-foot seas. Now for south central Alaska for tomorrow, we'll start over towards the Shelikof Strait, northeasterly winds 25 knots, northeasterly winds also west of the Barren Islands, 30 knots or so with about 10-foot seas. The Cook Inlet area, northerly winds 25 knots with 10-foot seas. As you get much further north in the Cook Inlet, north of Calgon Island, look for northerly winds 10 knots with 3-foot seas. Now over in Prince William Sound, look for basically northerly winds 25 knots with 4-foot seas. Cape Suckling to Cape Clear, northerly winds 20 knots with 5-foot seas, and Cape Clear to Gore Point, variable winds 10 knots. Southeast to the Barren Islands, south are northerly winds 10 knots with 4-foot seas, and the waters near Kodiak Island, northeasterly winds 30 knots with 6-foot seas. Now for Monday's forecast, look for Kodiak Island waters, southeasterly winds now 25 knots with 10-foot seas, and as it advances, that frontal system kind of moving north there. And then as we look over at Shelikof Strait, northeasterly winds 30 knots with 10-foot seas. West of the Barren Islands now will be easterly winds 35 knots with 13-foot seas. South of Calgon Island and the Cook Inlet area, northerly winds 30 knots with 10-foot seas. North of Calgon Island and Cook Inlet, northerly winds 15 knots with 3-foot seas. Prince William Sound, northeasterly winds 25 knots with 4-foot seas. And Cape Suckling to Cape Clear, easterly winds 25 knots with 5-foot seas. And Cape Clear to Gore Point, look for easterly winds 30 knots, 7-foot seas. And southeast to the Barren Islands, look for southeasterly winds 35 knots with 10-foot seas. Now for tomorrow, over along the Alaska Peninsula, south there in the eastern sections, easy for me to say, look for easterly winds 20 knots to 6-foot seas. Over the western section, south of the Alaska Peninsula, easterly winds 25 knots to 6-foot seas. North of the Alaska Peninsula, look for easterly winds 20 knots with 4-foot seas. In Bristol Bay, northeasterly winds 25 knots with 5-foot seas. For Monday's forecast, Bristol Bay now easterly winds 30 knots with 5-foot seas. So north of the Alaska Peninsula, southeasterly winds 25 knots to 6-foot seas. South of the Alaska Peninsula, on the eastern end, southwesterly winds 15 knots with 8-foot seas, and southeasterly winds 25 knots with 8-foot seas on the eastern end of the Alaska Peninsula. Okay, we got a lot going on here, but we'll start over towards the eastern end. Now we have those southerly storms tonight, but by tomorrow morning, afternoon, look for the winds become easterly, or correction, westerly at 35 knots, and seas will increase to about 22 feet or so, 15 feet in the west central areas with southwesterly winds, 15 knots, and that 16-foot swell. Central section, southeasterly winds, 15 knots with 7 feet north of in the Bering Sea side, and on the Pacific side 12 feet. And then as you get over towards eastern ends, pretty much the winds from east to southeast at about 20 to 25 knots, with seas anywhere from 6 feet north of the, or say in the Bering Sea side, and then the Pacific side seas 8 to 9 feet or so. Okay, and then as we continue in the east side, trying to look for the winds pretty much to south to southeast with 15 to 20 knots. As you get over towards the central sections, northwesterly winds 35 knots, so seas 14 to 16 feet. And then further west there, northwesterly winds 30 to 35 knots with 16-foot seas. Now as we move in towards the eastern Bering Sea, so towards the Pribilof Islands, and generally you see southeasterly winds most places with 20 to 30 knots or so. And moving on towards Monday's forecast, really not a little bit of a change, but not too much. And along the Arctic coast, the strongest winds will be on the Beaufort Sea side, about 55 knots out of the east, but easterly winds for the most part along the Arctic coast, and then, westerly winds, and then easterly winds, I should say, as we get in towards Monday. A real quick wrap up around the state. Frontal system moves over into the Yukon there. We'll see a high pressure ridge builds over the mainland. A frontal system kind of moving into the Bering Sea there, continuing there, and then we'll moving in towards Monday's forecast. We'll see some rain moving into the Gulf Coast. That's all for tonight. Good night.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.